Hello, dear listeners. Before we get to the episode, we want to take a moment to address the June 24th, 2022 Supreme Court decision to overturn Roe v. Wade. This decision stripped away the right to have a safe and legal abortion.
Everyone should have the freedom to decide what's best for themselves and their families, including when it comes to ending a pregnancy. This decision has dire consequences for individual health and safety, and could have harsh repercussions for other landmark decisions.
Restricting access to comprehensive reproductive care, including abortion, threatens the health and independence of all of us.
Learn more by visiting podvoices.help. If you're able to support others, please consider donating to abortion funds, as Planned Parenthood and Democrats generally have enough money. You can help by donating to local abortion funds, and to find out where to donate for each state, you can visit donationsfораbortion.com. That's the number 4, donationsfораbortion.com.
We encourage you to speak up, take care, and spread the word. Welcome to Nerds at Church, a podcast about nerdery and the Bible. I'm Pastor Emily, and I use pronouns like they, them, theirs.
And I'm Pastor Kay, and I use pronouns like she, her. In this episode, we'll discuss the 7th Sunday after Pentecost, also known as Proper 12 or Lectionary 17, which this year falls on July 24th, so some of you may be trying to do Christmas in July, and frankly, none of us can blame you. Why not?
I didn't even think about that.
I've been considering it. We'll see. I don't know that I can pull it off at this late date.
These are not the readings I would pick for that, but
no,
you
do something else. Please do something else.
Yeah.
The Annunciation sounds like a great plan. I'm just saying.
It's true, because that is around this time anyway.
We do have at least one content notification for you for this episode, which is that our deep dive is on Sodom and Gomorrah, which comes up during the first reading, and as you can imagine, we will probably be talking about all sorts of sexual violence and horrible ways of not being hospitable.
Yes. Check out the episode description for links to the Bible passages and other references we make in this episode.
So our deep dive for today is on Sodom and Gomorrah, because that does come up not so briefly in our first reading.
It comes up in our first reading, and was the actual story of Sodom and Gomorrah actually includes last week's Genesis reading as well.
Yeah.
The compilers of the Revised Common Lectionary did this thing where they had to take the politics of several denominations, from Catholicism to Lutheranism, Presbyterian, Methodist, Episcopalian, and combine them all into one, and
in the 80s.
In the 80s. And so while they were like, yeah, sure, let's talk about the divorce texts. And so we get them twice in the lectionary cycle. Sure. They did this weird, let's avoid stuff that we're not sure about.
Right.
And so we generally don't have stories like Sodom and Gomorrah.
Which, given the fact that a lot of people don't plan ahead a lot for warning their congregations, oh, by the way, next week we're going to hear this. Mm-hmm. That's, I don't think it's a bad thing to not blindside people with incredibly close to the heart considerations like this.
Right.
I would want to warn people in advance if they were going to do the actual, text of Genesis 19.
Yeah, it's not bad to not blindside people.
Yeah.
And also,
sometimes if you're going to talk about something, it's better to just talk about it.
Yes. Well, and there's, because people get blindsided by the passages where Jesus talks about divorce all the time.
Absolutely.
For that reason. So it takes...
Part of why lots of people don't like the church. Not that
but it requires planning on the part of those who are preaching and planning worship. But also, when the mainline denominations, both Protestant and Catholic, don't include readings that address Sodom and Gomorrah, it means that they're never going to be talked about in a regular worship service for anybody who follows the Revised Common Lectionary, which means that the only people preaching on them are going to be folks who don't follow the Revised Common Lectionary, evangelical, fundamentalist folks who will preach terrible theology without biblical context.
And it means that a lot of the people in churches that do use the Revised Common Lectionary or another lectionary never read these texts and only have to go on what they've heard on the radio or on TV or from their fundamentalist friends, which may not be as helpful as you would hope.
Yeah. So it is in that spirit that we are embracing Sodom and Gomorrah and the stories and what they represent and
what the text actually contains, which may surprise you.
Yes. So just for you all, we have a link to all of the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, because it is more than just the visiting of the angels to the town of Sodom.
Right.
And we get that because our Genesis reading starts before that.
Yes.
But it starts even before the Genesis reading. It starts with our reading last week, where Abraham provides generous hospitality to strangers who turn out to be angels of God.
Yes.
That's where the story of Sodom and Gomorrah starts. It's hard because, as a queer person, I'm like, Sodom and Gomorrah, grr. But also, the story of Sodom and Gomorrah is really powerful and has a lot to say about hospitality and economic exploitation and injustice.
Yes. And the evils of sexual violence, which God says is wrong.
Yes.
With absolutely no, equivocating or questionableness to it.
Mm-hmm.
It's just wrong.
Yeah.
Which I would like to, send to some of the people currently making laws in places where I live. But moving on.
Yeah. So part of it is hearing and being able to read the whole story. Also, if you hear background noise, it just started to pour down rain where I am. So
God knew that you needed nourishing in this moment and decided to send you, rain or something.
Yeah, something like that. We have a window air conditioner, and so that's good noise. So the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, like we mentioned, starts with Abraham and Sarah's and the servants' generous hospitality. It's like Abraham offers it and then has Sarah and the servants do it, as we talked about last week with Pastor Nick. So if you want to check out that, you can. Now that it is totally edited, so you can hear a slightly more polished version of it. But then it goes into our passage for today, where God and Abraham are talking, and Abraham is like, hey God, so your plans with Sodom, can we talk about those? And God is like, sure. And then Abraham is like, what if there are righteous people there, 50 righteous people, then maybe could you not destroy them? And God is like, okay. And Abraham's like, okay, but what if they're just missing 5 of those 50? What if it's 45? Then can you not destroy them? And God is like, okay. And Abraham keeps doing this. And God keeps going, okay. No resistance from God whatsoever.
And Abraham is clearly scared out of his socks the entire time.
Yes.
Just absolutely
terrified.
Yeah. Absolutely phrasing everything in the very gentlest, most, what's the opposite of condescending? Pleading.
Hesitant, reverent,
very
intimidated.
Humble. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And so, Abraham gets it down to 10, and God's like, for the sake of 10, I will not destroy it. And then Abraham stops.
I mean, we don't know why. Possibly he got interrupted by something.
Possibly.
I kind of doubt it. It did seem like a fairly important conversation, but, we don't know. I mean, I got interrupted by something last week.
It is true, you did. Yes, we don't know why Abraham stops exactly.
It's not like he's going out for a cup of coffee. That is not why. We're pretty sure. Right.
Right.
Yeah.
And we're pretty sure it was not
a little.
Just that he got interrupted.
Yeah.
Right, because then the next verse, which is not included in this passage, in our passage for today, but is the extra verse, is,
sure.
And God went their way when they had finished speaking to Abraham, and Abraham returned to his place. So, they clearly had, finished up. But Abraham did not go below 10. And
maybe God declared that the session was over? Did they hit the 50 minutes and it was time for God to go finish out God's notes?
If only God were a therapist.
I mean, given this example, I'm not sure that God would be a very good one, but...
Also true. And maybe it's that Abraham was like, oh, of course, Sodom will have at least 10 good people, even though...
Yeah, I don't actually know how big this city is supposed to be.
I don't either. Like, I do know that...
Multiple thousands, I would assume. But...
I mean, they have a king.
Yeah, it's a city, it's not a town.
Yeah, they have a king. Abraham has interacted with the king of Sodom before, and, like, got his cousin Lot back from... captivity. So like maybe Abraham thought that like surely there are at least 10 people who are righteous. Sure. But also like the law of large numbers would encourage that thinking. Like that's not an unreasonable thought, even for a much smaller town. You would expect. Yeah. But he didn't. And so we get it where there's anywhere between 1 and 5, depending on how you're counting Lot and his family. Yeah. Now I'm wondering if this is actually a lesson in why you should not overestimate the goodness of humans. Right? Never underestimate immorality. Yeah, that's kind of true. That I really have trouble arguing with that. Okay. But so what would have happened if Abraham had kept going? Right. And we'll get into that more when we actually talk about Genesis a little bit. But I suppose it's theoretically possible that if Abraham had just randomly tried to argue for the number pi, God might have gotten a little irritated. I don't know. But... I think Abraham would have had to know the number pi in order to do that. But yeah. I mean, Abraham seems to talk to God on a regular basis, so who knows? It's true. So then the angels go to Sodom. They go there and Lot is hanging out. And so Lot says, come to my place. I will provide you hospitality. As we talked about some last week, hospitality is an integral part of the culture in the Middle East especially, and especially in biblical times. You don't survive in desert cultures without deep, deep hospitality. So Lot is doing the normal thing. Right? Yeah. He's being a regular person who sees visitors and says, come stay with me. Yeah, and I don't know that we really have something in our modern American culture that we can compare to how important this hospitality thing is. Like, I have tried, but, well, okay, possibly white supremacy, but that's not a good thing. Yeah. But, like, in terms of just deeply, deeply ingrained, maybe the whole concept of the Midwesterners being scared of tornadoes does not really apply, because a lot of people will go out on their lawns and look at tornadoes. But I hear that people who grow up in California have this automatic reaction to feeling an earthquake that is just, like, ingrained. And so, like, that might be on the scale. I don't know. But maybe... I don't think that we have it. I think there's a lot more diversity in our culture. Yeah. And our culture is so very deeply integrated with really harmful and things from so many different places that, the problems of the melting pot. Yeah. So Lot, does the automatic thing and extends hospitality. And then the men of the city is what it says. Men sometimes is just men and sometimes is all people. It's hard to know exactly what this one is. It's not actually clear. Come and tell Lot they want to gang rape the 2 angels who are receiving hospitality from Lot. Right. They don't seem to know that they're angels, but that doesn't really seem to matter. Yeah, the 2 strangers. Yeah. They don't care who they are. And so they are like pounding down the door and Lot's like, no, 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 no. And then Lot like offers up his virgin daughters, which, let's be clear, that's a bad idea. Right. Absolutely. But also, it was within the bounds, to my understanding, of what hospitality meant in that time and place, because your guest's safety was supposed to be more important to you than your own child's safety, quite literally. Yep. So, like, Lot is not being a great dad here by any means, but he is following the rules of his culture as he's been taught. And also, like, you'll notice he says it, but it never actually happens. Because, of course, the goal of this crowd is, this isn't about sex. This isn't even about rape. This is about power. Yeah. And that's, ultimately, rape is about power. Yes. Rape is only ever about power. So, while they are trying to exert their power over these strangers, over this family, the angels finally are like, bam! And they strike the whole town with blindness, so that they can't find the door. This is not evidence that disability is a punishment from God.
No.
In this case, it was a way to stop harm.
Right.
But this is not like a lesson about disability or anything like that, just to be perfectly clear.
Also, I don't think it's made clear that this blindness is, intended to be permanent.
Yeah, it is not clear if it is permanent or not. It's kind of a moot point because
they all get destroyed rather briefly afterwards, but which is, probably another conversation. But
the explicit piece in verse 11 is so that they were unable to find the door.
Yes.
So that they couldn't break down the door, so that they couldn't.
And I have to say, there's a certain element of, whimsy to that phrase. Because of how they phrased it, I immediately imagined Benny Hill music in the background as soon as they become blind and they can't find the door. And it goes from, actual threatening violence and very serious and terrifying to, just...
a comedic,
farce. Yeah.
I can see that.
And I love the idea of God's angels deciding to respond to threats of violence with just general wackiness.
Yeah.
But, this is how seriously we take you and your ideas of power.
Yeah. There's an episode of What We Do in the Shadows where the vampires, it's a mockumentary about vampires.
Yes.
Where the vampires and the werewolves are having, a showdown. And so they're like, okay, this is the ultimate thing. We're doing, 1 against 1. You pick your vampire, we'll pick our werewolf. And there's a werewolf who can, turn when it's not the full moon. And so then the vampires, everybody is, terrified because, this is, getting real, to coin R2-D2.
Mm-hmm.
And then they get to pick one weapon. And the vampire picks out a squeaky toy and throws it, and the werewolf goes for it. And it's it just breaks the tension because you're sitting there what is going to happen? How do you get out of this? There are multiple more seasons of this show, right. And they are not going to beat this werewolf. So that's more what I think of when I think of what the angels did and what you're saying. So then the angels tell Lot, grab your sons-in-laws, which is to say the folks who are betrothed to your daughters, bring them out. We're going to destroy this place. The sons-in-laws are not in the house. So it raises the question of, where were they last night?
Yeah.
Right?
And my understanding is that if they were betrothed to the daughters, they should have been living there. That's how that works.
Yeah. So Lot goes and tells them and says, hey, we gotta go. The city's gonna be destroyed. And they don't believe him. They think he's joking. So they don't go with him.
Right. And I suppose, to be fair, if they had been there and gotten struck blind the night before, I would be inclined to believe Lot if something extraordinary like that had just happened to me. So maybe that's actually evidence that they weren't there. We don't. Maybe? It doesn't say that all of the people of the town were there.
Yeah, it just says. Some. But it says but it doesn't say some either. It says the men of the city.
The men of the city. Yeah, but at what point
unclear.
At what point can that many people crowd around a house?
Yeah. So then Lot and Mrs. Lot and their 2 daughters take off.
I really wish we knew Lot's wife's name.
Me too, but
Mrs. Lot is just such a ridiculous way to...
It's true, but it points to that, right?
Yes, exactly.
It's my Hebrew Bible.
I'm not saying there's anything better to use. I'm just...
He first did it with Noah. And
yes,
Mrs.
I know.
Noah,
it makes me think of Mrs. Potato Head, and anyway.
Well, maybe they were Mr. Potato and Mrs. Head or something.
And there's a hyphen. Oh, I love that. Okay, excellent.
Anyway, so they run off. The angel says, don't look back. Mrs. Lot looks back, turns into a pillar of salt. It is unclear if this is just is consumed by grief and tears, is caught up in the fire. There's a whole lot.
I don't think you meant to say a whole lot. I think I think that was accidental.
That was brilliant. Well done, Emily's subconscious. Pastor Debbie Griffin actually has 2 really good sermons on the actual part in the town of Sodom, in the city of Sodom, and this part after with Lot's wife that we'll link to.
Sure.
She's my pastor.
Yeah.
She's a pastor of the congregation I worshipped with a lot when I was in Iowa. So she turns into salt, and the rest of them keep going. They get to the cave, and then the two daughters are worried that they're not going to have kids ever, and so they get their father drunk and rape him.
Yeah, which, like, that is a very quick turnaround to decide that your life has just changed like that. But, wow.
Yep. And, like, we don't really know how long it took, because they, like, settled there, but it's right, like, it's not learning lessons.
Yeah.
But also, like, their father, offered them up, so there's not, like, a good understanding of
some anger there.
Sexual ethics in their family.
Yeah. This might also be, like, actual facts proof that God is not a therapist, because if God was, presumably, like, half of this never would have happened. But, yeah.
Yeah. And a lot of this is, right, this is a story of how different peoples came to be in that area. So this is the story of how the Ammonites and the Moabites came to be,
right.
because the kids that they have are Moab and Ben-Ami.
Right.
Yeah. That's kind of the whole arc of this story, because then after that, it talks about Abraham and Sarah moving on and settling elsewhere. So that's kind of the end of this whole passage. But so frequently we take really just like the couple of verses
right.
from what the men of the city say within the context of, like, the Bible never talks about sex explicitly. They don't have,
and the euphemisms in ancient Hebrew are a little hilarious and
yes,
kind of weird,
yeah.
especially in English. Like,
yep.
Yeah. I mean, English euphemisms are equally weird.
Also true. Yeah. Biblical feet don't come up in this passage, but if they come up in other passages, just know that it's not.
It's not 100%, but it's like, 80% of feet.
Yeah. So when people use the story of Sodom and Gomorrah harmfully, right. They take those couple of verses of what the men of the city are saying to Lot about these strangers and make that the story rather than the whole right. context of hospitality, right? It starts out with deep hospitality from Abraham right. to these strangers who turn out to be angels of God.
And it feels a little, I don't know that ironic is the right word for it, but on the nose that so many people have taken those couple of verses out of context and used them to their own ends, when this entire story is about not taking people and using them to your own ends. Like, and that's bad. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So maybe don't treat the Bible the way we shouldn't treat people. Like, that seems...
Yeah. This passage comes up a bunch of other times, and
yeah.
we have links to that. Most of the time, it is connected to iniquity. They're either using Sodom and Gomorrah as an example of, like, I'm mad at this town, and it will be for them like Sodom and Gomorrah.
Sometimes it's prophets, sometimes it's God, mm-hmm. sometimes it's God speaking mm-hmm. through prophets.
Yeah, and the passage from Ezekiel 16, which is included in that link that's in our episode description, is probably the best, like, biblical summary of what the real sin of Sodom was.
Right.
The real guilt.
Yeah. Yes, so in Ezekiel chapter 16, verses 49 through 50, we read, "This was the guilt of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters had pride, excess of food, and prosperous ease, but did not aid the poor and needy. They were haughty and did abominable things before me. Therefore I removed them when I saw it." So when we're talking about Sodom and Gomorrah in the Bible, it's connected to iniquity, and this is a great example, right? It is excess, it is wealth that is then not used to help those who do not have what they need to get by. The only reference I found that refers to Sodom and Gomorrah and doesn't have this iniquity aspect is the reference from Jude chapter 1, which does talk about sexual immorality and unnatural lust as what Sodom and Gomorrah are about, which is also true, right? Rape is immoral and unnatural. Yes.
So it fits, but because of the ways that particularly evangelical and fundamentalist Christianity has twisted scripture when sexual immorality or unnatural lust come up. Nowadays, the kind of automatic go-to becomes queer consensual relationships, and that's not what this is about. So don't be like that. Also, if you still have not been convinced by us that Sodom and Gomorrah is not about queer relationships, then you should check out Judges 19 through 21. Judges 19 through 21 and Genesis 19 through 20 are very, very similar stories. So in Judges 19 through 21, there is a Levite who takes a concubine. So enslaves a woman as his like forced wife.
Right.
From Bethlehem in Judah. And they get in a fight and she leaves. And then he comes after her after a little bit and tries to get her back and eventually does. And on the way back, they get to Jebus, that is Jerusalem. And when they're near there, one of the servants says, let's stay here because it's a place to stay. And the Levite is like, no, I'm not going to stay with foreigners. Let's go to Gibeah. And so they go to Gibeah and they try to stay there. And it's a city of the Benjaminites. And that evening, there's a man who sees them in the square of the city and says, come stay with me. Nobody else has offered to take you in. Come stay with me. And so they say, okay. So they do. And then the men of the city surround the house and start pounding on the door. They want the stranger, right? Again, they want to gang rape the stranger. They want to exert power over this stranger. And this time, the stranger is not an angel who can just like scatter them into comedy. The man again offers up his virgin daughter and his concubine, and the men of the city say no. So then the stranger, this Levite, takes his concubine and puts her outside the house. Right. And they raped her all night. And it is unclear if she was alive or dead when he found her on the threshold of the door to the house the next morning. After that, he dismembers her and mails pieces of her body to all these different towns, and they all attack Benjamin because that's where Gibeah is. And then don't want the tribe of Benjamin to completely die out, so then they steal brides from this other place. It's a whole complicated and problematic story.
Yeah.
And no one ever uses it to condemn heterosexuality.
Right.
Right. It is.
Because it's not ultimately about heterosexuality.
Yep. It is about power and abuse of power, and particularly sexual abuse of power.
Yeah. Although I suppose it is one of those stories that makes you ask, are the straights okay? And the answer is clearly no, not really.
The cisheads are not okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there has been a shift in interpretation, which we know because if you look at how biblically the stories of Sodom and Gomorrah have been interpreted, it's very different from how so many people understand them today. I believe it was in about 1,000, and Pastor Debbie talks about this in her first sermon, but there was a shift in culture from this deeply ingrained hospitality, which is still very much a part of Middle East culture, but in a little bit of a different way. This shift towards land owning and proprietorship of space and more economic advancement, and it kind of opens up towards capitalism in the thousands and is headed that way, right? Is headed towards more stratification of wealth and less emphasis on hospitality and economic justice. And so to kind of diminish the ways that the story of Sodom and Gomorrah are about hospitality and justice and taking care of those in need, particularly in Europe, that's when it shifted to being a story about sexual morality, and not rape as bad, but sexual morality as in condemning queerness and those sorts of things. That's a shift that has happened in interpretation. It's not something that was common for the first at least millennia of this scripture. And this scripture is older than 2,000 years, but certainly within Christianity, it was not even part of Christian interpretation for the first millennia. So
yeah. And if you're interested in a Jewish look at Hebrew scriptures, which would make perfectly reasonable sense, I would strongly recommend the book Wrestling with God and Men, Homosexuality in the Jewish Tradition by Rabbi Stephen Greenberg, who is a gay Orthodox rabbi. And this is not just dealing with this text in particular, although he does, of course, look at it, but it is a lovely look at Jewish exegesis, you might say. Exegesis meaning to pull meaning from the text instead of inserting your own agenda into it. I have very much valued this book and found it very helpful. And then, of course, in pop culture, there are a wide variety of references to Sodom and Gomorrah, some of which are deeply problematic, and we will be ignoring those.
Mm-hmm.
So there are also references in pop culture to Sodom and Gomorrah that are, significantly less horrifying, and we'll take a look at some of those. Of course, in the movie Dogma, Ben Affleck and Matt Damon remind us that raining down fire and brimstone is quite the workout. And so that took some effort on their part, and they would like some acknowledgement of that. Thank you. I think they actually acknowledge that it might not have been, the most moral thing in the universe to do, but, by golly, that was a day of work they put in.
Yeah. And then it comes up in La Vie Boheme in Rent, right? The line,
Yes.
Sodomy, it's between God and me.
Yes.
Right. They're naming some of the beautiful diversity of who we are as humans and how we interact as humans in this song. And so I generally, when we talk about sodomy or sodomite, I specifically did not include those passages in the links that we provided for scripture links because that's not an accurate translation, and that's a word that has been created in recent history to mean particular things. But I love that, making fun and naming the real deep truth, right? That the relationship that I have with another person sexually is between me and God, or my understanding of the divine. Also between me and that person, but,
Yeah, and if you want to widen our references out to just corrupt cities that have been destroyed, or that concept, in the Christian Bale Batman movies, you have the League of Shadows, which is an organization of people who intentionally go out to destroy corrupt cities, and of course Gotham City is the next one on their list. The fact that it happens to vaguely resemble New York City is not something we need to pay attention to, apparently. Whatever.
Yeah. That's interesting because I think of Gotham City as Chicago a lot, but...
Oh, interesting. Okay.
And Numenor in J.R.R. Tolkien's Silmarillion, which is here's all the extra information about Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit.
Have 1,000 pages of lore. Boom.
Yes.
Yeah.
So in that version, Numenor is a corrupt city that is also destroyed.
Yeah. And of course, the city of Atlantis originally dates back to something written by Plato, and that might have been what happened to Atlantis, but given that I guess Plato never actually finished the work about Atlantis, we don't know. Of course, also, Atlantis might not be a historical thing, so...
Yeah. And in Avatar, there's lots of cities that are destroyed by the Fire Nation, but that's more the corruption of the Fire Nation than the actual cities themselves.
Yeah, and if you're interested, the TV Tropes website has a list of real-life cities and towns that had a reputation for corruption that were then destroyed, generally by nature, on the Soiled City on a Hill trope page. There are, about a dozen of them, I think. And I am including this example because I cannot believe it's real, but I did recently discover that yes, I did not dream this. This was not something that I came up with while I was sick as a teenager. Apparently, way back in the day in 1969, Clint Eastwood and Lee Marvin did a musical together, which is a sentence I never thought I'd say out loud. And it's called Paint Your Wagon. I believe that the musical itself existed before them, and I cannot comment on the quality of the musical itself, but the movie they did is pretty terrible on a number of fronts, but it does apparently actually exist. And there is a bit in there about a corrupt city that first gets built up, and then eventually, because they're digging underneath it all the time for gold, winds up getting destroyed and falling into the mountain, as one does. I do not recommend this movie, in case I was in any way unclear. It was not particularly good. I still can't believe it actually exists. So.
Gotcha. I have not seen it and am totally okay with that.
Yeah, no, that's a completely fair way to spend your life. I approve. Just the phrase Clint Eastwood and Lee Marvin did a musical together still boggles my head. But.
That's fair. Yeah, so, Sodom and Gomorrah, not what it's chalked up to be these days. And for those of you who are worship leaders or planners or preachers, if you're going to include the Genesis reading, it's really important to say something about Sodom and Gomorrah. Otherwise, you will just let people perpetuate the harmful views that they've been taught by other people.
Yeah. Also, in the interest of content notifications and so forth, I guess I would say, having read both the Genesis passage and the Judges passage that we're linking to, the Genesis passage kind of turns out to be a little less emotionally scarring and horrifying than you kind of expect, because it's all about the really horrible stuff mostly doesn't happen.
Mm-hmm.
And the Judges passage is so much worse than you would initially expect it to be. So, like, if you go to read either or both of those, keep that in mind. Don't read Judges, like, right before you fall asleep in a dark and spooky farmhouse. That seems like a bad choice. I'm just saying.
Agreed. So as we dive into our readings, our first reading is Genesis chapter 18, verses 20 through 32. Abraham, in what might be the one example in the Bible of a successful attempt to bargain with God, asks God to be merciful to the inhospitable city of Sodom, for the sake of the good people who also live there, and then gives up the negotiations, despite receiving absolutely no resistance from God. So we already talked about this some in our deep dive, but one of the themes is negotiations, and Abraham starts out as like a great negotiator. He's just like going for it. But then he ends up and he's like almost as bad as Rory and Lorelai when they try to negotiate in Gilmore Girls. They're like trying to negotiate compensation or something, and instead of getting closer to each other, they like skew outwards. I think it's like to like sponsor knitting. In one of the episodes there's knit-a-thon and they're trying to get sponsors, and it's like, so you want to sponsor me $5 a skein? And then it's like, what about $10 total? And it's like, oh, $30 a skein. Oh, $5 total. And it's like, that's not how that's
No.
not how that works.
No. In general, don't take advice on how to negotiate from TV. Like, that usually is not going to go well.
I mean, also that, yeah.
And then in verse 21, we read that God said, I must go down and see whether they have done altogether according to the outcry that has come to me, and if not, I will know. So even God knows to fact check people. Like, even God will investigate. Even God does not automatically believe gossip and rumor. Maybe God would approve if in this country we decided to fund real investigatory journalism. Just a thought.
What?
Superman was a journalist for a reason. Actually, a number of reasons. Just saying.
That's fantastic. I am a fan of investigatory journalism because I have been on the wrong side of journalists who just want to let everyone tell their stories, or just like take police commentary as fact, which is untrue almost always.
While we're at it, responsible journalism does not include giving Nazis a platform to share their views.
It's true.
Just randomly throwing that one out there.
You don't have to platform harmful views.
Yeah.
I also read verse 21 and I was thinking that this was a great like biblical or divine argument for evidence-based research. Also known as the scientific method and science more broadly, right? There's the like,
sure,
I have a hypothesis. God's hypothesis is that this city is wicked. And then you say, okay, how are we going to measure it? And that comes next, right? The negotiations of like, how do we measure how wicked the city is? And Abraham's like, well, what about this? What about this? And then you go and test and report.
That's when they find out there's fewer than 10.
Yep. Exactly. Yay, science.
Indeed. And then in verse 25, we read that Abraham said, Far be it from you, that is God, to do such a thing, to slay the righteous with the wicked, so that the righteous fare as the wicked. Far be that from you. Shall not the judge of all the earth do what is just? And, of course, this is as opposed to the famous line from what I now know of as the first massacre of the Albigensian Crusade. I may have mispronounced that, in 1209 in France. I have previously mentioned this line on this podcast, I believe, and I believe I mistakenly claimed that it was something that Charlemagne or someone related to Charlemagne said. According to Wikipedia, I got that wrong. And it was apparently the abbot who was in charge of the crusading knights at the time.
Even better. Instead of Charlemagne, it was a religious authority.
But basically, crusading knights were invading a town that several Cathars lived there, and of course, in 1209, Cathars were, heretics according to the Catholic Church. And so they invaded, and someone counseling the crusaders on what to do said, "Kill them all, God will know his own."
Oof.
To excuse what turned out to be the mass murder of 20,000 people, most of whom were civilians or children. Maybe they should have read Genesis instead of woefully misapplying 2 Timothy 2 verse 19, in which it does actually say that God does know God's own. Yes, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't mean that you have to, literally murder everyone. That is not how that goes.
Yeah, that's not in God's plans for the world.
Yes.
Yep.
So, Abraham is very clear that God would not countenance such a thing.
Yeah.
And maybe we should all read that passage a little more closely.
Mm-hmm. And in verse 26, God's response to Abraham is to say, "If I find at Sodom 50 righteous in the city, I will forgive the whole place for their sake." And I wish that Abraham went all the way down to 1. But it is a great example of, as I watched the Green Lantern last night, so it is fresh in my mind, but the idea of goodness or humanness or what, a particular characteristic or a particular person can save all, right? 50 people, or ultimately 10 people, would have saved the whole city.
Right.
Just like the Earthling Green Lantern ends up saving all of the Green Lanterns and all of the Earthlings because he has, the one particular characteristic that he needs.
Cool.
That is needed. Yeah.
Our second reading is from Colossians chapter 2, verses 6 through 15, and possibly including verses 16 through 19. The author encourages Christians to remain focused on Christ and Christ's message, rather than human ideas about that message.
So one of the themes in this passage is this idea that you receive membership through another, right? We receive membership through Christ. And it reminded me of the Ember in the Ashes book, which I'm in a place where I need to reread those because it's been a while. But the Ember in the Ashes, all of the scholars receive condemnation through the acts of these particular scholars who are their ancestors, but then they also are redeemed because of the actions of some of the scholars among them. And so it's this how are you grouped in with others, which frequently happens to marginalized and oppressed people, where we get grouped in, and so we have to be accountable for others who do wrong, which is not fair, but also is part of how the world is working these days.
And then in verse 7 we read, "Rooted and built up in God and established in the faith, just as you were taught, abounding in thanksgiving." So if I was going to compare this relationship with God to a spell from D&D, I suppose it would be less like Thorn Whip, which is a attack spell that lets you hit and move around other people, and more like, say, Tree Stride, which lets you teleport from one tree to another, as long as you know those trees. So, rooted and built up in.
I like that it's as long as you know those trees. Sounds like an Ent or Druid spell.
Yes, it is a Druid spell, yep. And then in verse 8 we read, "See to it that no one takes you captive through philosophy and empty deceit, according to human tradition, according to the elemental spirits of the universe, and not according to Christ." Offhand, I do realize that it's kind of interesting that the Bible is apparently admitting here that there are elemental spirits of the universe, but I don't really know that we have the time to address that right now. But, the Bible says a lot of things that we don't always pay attention to.
That's true.
To be fair. But in the West Wing episode, The Red Mass, Josh sends Donna to a self-help seminar that is basically trying to do this by distorting and recycling various philosophical ideas in order to brainwash people to give them money. To convince the people to give the self-help seminar people money, that is. And Donna is actually so angry about this and having to go to this thing that she allows Josh to believe for a couple of minutes that it's actually worked, which is one of the most hilarious scenes in the show.
It's brilliant. I love Donna. She's just great.
Absolutely.
Donna in West Wing is great. Donna in The Doctor is great.
Yes.
Apparently, just if your name is Donna, it's a good sign. And then in verse 14 we read, "Erasing the record that stood against us with its legal demands." That is, Christ is erasing that record. Mm-hmm. Christ set this aside, nailing it to the cross. This sentence, points towards this legality concept, which is not actually Jewish or Pauline. So this Colossians is a book where we don't know who wrote it. It's possible that it was Paul, but it's also very possible that it was not. I tend to think that it was not Paul. But it's very common in, like, Christian evangelicalism, right? The, like, legality and black and white kind of nature of things.
Right. Which is weird given, how Jesus died, but...
Yeah, Jesus died legally. But it also reminds me of, like, Star Wars, and a lot of times, like, the evil ones do things by the books, right? Emperor Palpatine became emperor because he got people to change the laws. And what is lawful is not necessarily good, right? I think about the ways laws have changed in this country, and sometimes for the better, and recently for the worse.
Yeah.
The laws in Iowa make it easier to get away with hitting protesters with your car.
Yeah.
And people have already started doing that more frequently. So just because it's lawful does not make it good.
Right.
That's why I'm chaotic good. And then in verse 16 we read, "Therefore do not let anyone condemn you in matters of food and drink, or of observing festivals, new moons, or Sabbath." Like, they're pointing towards this discrepancy between Jewish followers of the way and non-Jewish followers of the way, and the goal is to tell non-Jewish followers of the way, hey, it's okay if you're not Jewish first.
Yeah.
This is not intended to condemn Judaism.
No.
Though anti-Semitism is, very powerful. So that sometimes is how it comes out. But it reminds me of, like, if the game of life in this case, not the actual game of life, but, like, if life were a game, it's not a competitive game. And maybe it's not totally cooperative. I'd like life to be a cooperative game, but maybe it's not totally cooperative.
Sure.
But it makes me think of how I try to play Settlers of Catan, or Ticket to Ride, or Machi Koro, where it's like, I'm doing my thing, you're doing your thing, and we'll try not to, like, bump into each other. But if we do, we'll just have to work around it.
Sure.
Granted, in those games, if you start to play Cutthroat, I will return the favor. But I don't like to be the first person to be Cutthroat. So I just like to play my best and you play your best and see how it goes. Our gospel reading for this episode is Luke chapter 11, verses 1 through 13. Jesus teaches the disciples the Lord's Prayer and encourages them to ask God for anything they need. One of the themes in this passage is this pattern of prayer. So Jesus is not actually prescribing, you must say these words, though certainly that's how Christians have taken it, hence why this is now called the Lord's Prayer.
Right.
But it's here is the pattern of how you can pray. Here are the things that you should pray, that you could pray for if you want to pray, right? To pray for your daily bread, to pray for forgiveness, those sorts of things. It reminds me of the Great British Baking Show, that, like, the point of it is the baking and what you've made, but there's so much that has become built up around, like, Paul Hollywood's handshake and whether or not you get a handshake from Paul.
Yeah.
That, like, that is the thing, and it's not people. His handshake is not the best thing in the world.
No. I guess I'm kind of surprised that no one has actually taken it as a challenge at this point to try to win Great British Bake Off without getting a Paul Hollywood handshake. Like, it seems like we as people are into, doing weird things like that enough that someone would have tried it by now.
Right? Or at least, like, just put gherkins in everything you make, and then Paul won't like it. But it's his own fault. It's not because it's, like, inherently bad or anything.
Right.
Yeah. And then in verse 6, Jesus is talking about this hypothetical person who is asking a neighbor in the middle of the night for bread, and they say that they want the bread, for a friend of mine has arrived, and I have nothing to set before him. So it is, again, the hospitality that we've been talking about lately, of deep care and concern for another, for a stranger, for a friend. And it reminded me of Encanto, because the Madrigal family in Encanto is very much about hospitality, right? Like, they have these gifts for the sake of the whole community and to better care for the whole community. And there's like a problematic route it takes. But they also, like, are not totally completely on board with that, because they still have, like, hang-ups and stuff about Mirabelle in particular and the ways that she is or is not welcome or fully part of the family. But yeah.
Sure. And then in verse 8 we read, I tell you, even though he will not give up and give him anything because he is his friend, at least because of his persistence he will get up and give him whatever he needs. So yes, this verse is saying that being stubborn with God is not only allowed, but actually encouraged.
Mm-hmm.
And if you want an example of this, I've always thought that Neelix in Star Trek Voyager was especially good at it. He was very good at being cheerfully persistent at people until they gave in and he got whatever the ship needed that week. And it's sort of a delight to watch him.
That's awesome.
And then in verse 9 we read, So I say to you, ask and it will be given you, search and you will find, knock and the door will be opened to you. And so it does sound here like you do actually need to put in some kind of effort. Like, everything is not just going to fall on your head out of the sky, which is probably good. Like, gravity is difficult, and also that would hurt. But also, like, you will need to go looking for answers or whatever it is that you need. And this reminds me of the old joke about the person who prayed that they would win the lottery day after day after day for a year, and finally God showed up and said, would you please just buy a ticket already? That was my grandmother's favorite blonde joke. And since she was blonde, she was allowed to tell it. So
you can't actually win the lottery if you don't have a ticket. I thought you were going to tell the story of, like, the person who, like, there's a massive flood, and so the person's like, praying to God to help, and then a helicopter comes by and is like, hey,
yeah, no,
let us
it
help
turns
you.
out that trying to help yourself in that case might also help.
And then in verse 11, Jesus asks, is there anyone among you who, if your child asks for a fish, will give a snake instead of a fish? And the real question is, what if they gave an eel? It's like a snake fish.
Is it a screaming eel? From Princess Bride?
I don't like Princess Bride.
Oh,
that's how we're going to get the hate mail. Hey, dear listeners, I don't like Princess Bride. Bring it on.
Yeah, there were eels in biblical times and places, like, they actually get mentioned in the Bible a few times, so I suppose that's an option, but also, like, I have met those parents who would give a eel in response for your child asking for a fish, and I don't like any of them. So we're just, gonna...
I mean, nowadays, like, if you're eating sushi, which now I'm gonna want sushi after this, right? Like, is sushi made with eels, and there's sushi made with fish, and there's sushi made with both. I also just went to the National Aquarium for the first time ever. It's ridiculously expensive, but there were eels there. And there was, like in the shark tank, there was a ray that looks like a shark, but is actually not. It was really
interesting.
Cool. I couldn't remember that.
I'm also pretty sure that the one thing that eels are generally known for is that they will literally eat anything. So, like, maybe you don't want to give your kid that to eat, because who knows what that eel ate before it died.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
So, on that cheerful note, and now for our newest segment, Let's Make a Muppets Musical, where we cast these Bible stories with Muppets and the occasional token human. So, Emily, did you have any thoughts on who to cast in our Bible readings today?
Yes. Obviously, Count Von Count must be part of the countdown in the Genesis reading, because how could you not?
Yes, I was a little saddened to see that you got there first. So that is an excellent choice.
I rarely write mine down, so I rarely get there first, but I was thinking ahead.
And then in the gospel reading, I was looking at that one, and I noticed that as soon as Jesus answers his disciples' question of how do you pray, or how should we pray, rather, Jesus immediately goes into talking about food. Like, I don't know if he just had the munchies, or if it was, like, right before lunchtime, or what, but that immediately made me think of, wouldn't Cookie Monster make a wonderful Jesus? Like, I think the glorious abundance of cookies would suit Jesus well. And also probably make communion more interesting, I'm just saying.
I have had cookies for communion before because, pandemic. But
adventurous life, yes.
That would be delightful. I would love that. Thanks for joining us. Catch us next time when we'll discuss nerdery connections to the scripture readings for the 8th Sunday after Pentecost. This podcast has been produced by us, Emily Ewing and Kay Rohloff. For more fun, check us out on Twitter and Facebook at Nerds at Church, or contact us at nerdsatchurch@gmail.com.
Also, if you like what you've heard, rate us or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Facebook, or wherever you catch your podcasts. If you want access to our uncut guest episodes and interviews, live Q&As, and more, support us on Patreon at patreon.com/nerdsatchurch. It's cheaper than buying cookies for your entire church to have communion with.
Indeed. It's also cheaper than staying at a hotel when traveling.
Yes, absolutely. In fact, it's probably cheaper than staying at an Airbnb.
Yes. An entire year would be cheaper than either of those options, I think.
Yeah.
Also, let us know on Facebook or Twitter who you would cast for Let's Make a Muppets musical for this episode.
As the ancient Christians said,
Pax
Pax
vobiscum.
vobiscum.